All right, here's the last point for today. It's actually quite possible that you're going to be doing this as homework for Monday. We're going to talk about historical fallacies, or I titled this Problems in History. You could also say these are historical fallacies. Things that go wrong in history, ways to do history incorrectly, errors. So, remember logic fallacies, tu quoque, post hoc, ergo propter. History has some similar ones. Okay, so here's some ways in which, I don't want to just say the same thing over and over again. Maybe I can just jump in. Ways in which you can get history wrong. So one of the first one is to sort of never forget that in history we are dealing with imperfect knowledge. I talked about that a little bit earlier in regards to narrative. We're dealing with imperfect knowledge. We don't know everything. Which means, frankly, we have to guess sometimes. And that means the historian should often be a little bit cautious. We don't know things for sure. So as a general rule, I'm always kind of skeptical of someone who says, yes, really sure, this is exactly how it happened. Whereas, in my opinion, most good historians will usually say, well, we think this is how it happened. Maybe it was this other thing, but we're reasonably sure it's this. I have to admit, this habit of mine sometimes bugs my wife when she asks me something, and I default to saying well, I'm not sure, it could be this or it could be this, and she could simply be saying no, seriously, which brand of food did you want for dinner? That sort of thing, where I get a little too up in my own head as a history teacher. But this means the historian needs to be cautious and a little bit humble. Don't be certain. I know that sounds funny, but it's kind of true. Kind of true, especially in some periods we're going to be talking about this year. The early Middle Ages, there's often big gaps where we just don't know much. Here's a point. The Romans built with stone. Roman houses were made of stone. And so it's easy to find Roman settlements because the stone's still there. But in England, when the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons came in and they built with wood, and wood rots. So it's really hard to find Anglo-Saxon settlements. This might lead someone to think well, there were clearly no people here because there's no settlements. When we don't know, because we don't know, how there might have been huge Anglo-Saxon towns, and we just don't have any record of them. So there's that, we don't know what we don't know factor. That's important. Okay, then there's the general issue of bias in history, right? Letting our views be slanted, warped, you name it. There's a lot of different ways this can work, right? It could be political, it could be national, right? It could be religious. There's all kinds of bias. A liberal historian is maybe not going to say so nice things about a conservative president, and a conservative president about a liberal historian, well, same problem. Especially 100 years ago when national histories were really big, people who were French wanted to write great French histories about how the French were really awesome, and those Germans were all perfidious, just evil all the way through. And the Germans, of course, were saying the same things about the French, right? Or religious, or maybe ideological. When the Reformation happened, the Protestants wrote histories talking about how the Middle Ages were dark and backwards and oppressive and superstitious because of those darn Catholics with their bad papist views. And of course the Catholics said, no, they weren't. The Middle Ages were wonderful and awesome. And you Protestants came along and messed everything up. Probably neither was completely right. I would say oftentimes in biased narratives, there's often at least a grain of truth. It's kind of like how stereotypes sometimes have some truth to them. It's just not the whole truth. So watch for bias. And look, we all have biases. We cannot escape them. We will never be perfectly free of bias. We should try to strive for objectivity, to try to be as objective and honest about the truth as possible. Sometimes I think I'm harder on historical actors or sides, as you will, that I might happen to like, partly because I don't want to be too favorable, if that makes sense. I don't know if I can come up with a good example, but if I was teaching a course on Texas history, I love Texas history. Texas is really cool. I am a proud Texan in many ways. But as a result of that, because of that awareness, I might actually overemphasize some of the bad parts in Texas history because I don't want to be accused of bias. Now, am I going too far the other way? Well, maybe, but it's a tough balancing act. Okay, so bias. Watch out for bias. Next, here are some isms for you, right? Watch out for the historical fallacy of deconstructionism. And this is kind of in vogue in a lot of universities. There's this desire, deconstructionism, to tear apart old myths and pieties. I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean myth in a bad way. Like the narratives we used to tell ourselves as a people, and this is what it means to be American, and these are all good. And you have modern historians who want to come along and say, like, no, that's not really true. These guys weren't actually nice. They were motivated by economic reasons, or they were really bad for these other things. And when you come along and tear apart a people's narrative and don't leave anything in its place, what have you left them with? Nothing. That's no good. We should be critical. We should try to find the truth. And usually people aren't saints and they're not perfect. But we shouldn't go overboard. So there's deconstructionism. There's minimalism. Sometimes what I like to call monocausal narratives. That's a fun $5 word for you. This is where you boil everything down to sort of just one thing. If you ever hear someone say, history is really just this, what follows is sure to be a simplification, and it's going to be historical minimalism. And they're probably going to be missing and leaving out lots of important things. There's different ways this can manifest, and some of it's not all bad. I read a book once on the history of salt. Yes, really, salt. It was actually pretty cool. Salt has played a big role in history. It's important. But if you just look at history through the lens of like how salt has impacted history, you're going to come away having an outsized view of the importance of salt in history. And this book kind of went overboard. It would just say, like, did you know salt played a big important role in this historical event? And it's like, you're overdoing it. So if you get a documentary or a movie which, tells a narrative as just like one thing, like this is the one thing you need to know about these people. If you said that the American founding was only about liberty and wonderfulness and the American founding fathers were wonderfully perfect people and did no wrong whatsoever, that's overly simple. On the flip side, if you say that all you need to know about American history is slavery, you're missing something, right? I think in some ways we've kind of backlashed in our sort of like public history about America as Americans. History 60 years ago, I think, was too triumphalist. Sometimes people say it was whitewashed. It didn't talk about the bad parts of American history. I think now we've gone kind of too far the other direction. My hope is that eventually the pendulum will even out and we'll have a more balanced view. But I understand those backlashes to some extent. Right, minimalism. Then finally, presentism. Okay, this one actually is kind of a bit of this is one that I kind of care about a lot. Presentism. This is when you judge the past by the standards of the present. Ultimately, this is a failure of empathy. It's a failure and the moral imagination. It's a failure to understand people. Judging the past by the standards of the present. So this is when you come along and boil people down in the past to sort of just one thing, perhaps. Or you criticize them because they're not just like us. I remember talking to someone once who said, like, oh no, Aristotle's not very good. I don't like Aristotle. Aristotle didn't like women because Aristotle, he had misogynistic views towards women. And it is true. Aristotle thought women were inferior to men. He thought that women had fewer teeth than men. That's not the only reason he thought they were inferior, but he did believe that. And yes, he's wrong. Aristotle was wrong about that. I'm happy to say that. But if that's all you know about Aristotle, or that's all you say about Aristotle, you're missing all the other really cool and interesting and important things about Aristotle. The Greeks and the Romans had and practiced slavery. I'm really glad I don't live in a world like that. They also practiced infanticide. I'm really glad I don't live in a world like that. Like open infanticide, leaving babies in, pottery. On the side of the road. You can't tell a history of the Greeks and the Romans without including that stuff. But if that's all you know about them, you're missing a bunch of other things. There's also another gray area in this, where we need to realize that people in different times and places would have had different views about things, and it's unfair to accuse them of not having our own views, right? It's unfair to say that people in the past weren't as enlightened or moral or tolerant as we are, which makes it sound as if we are the ultimate standards and we know everything. And here's ultimately why I think this is a bad idea and you should be really careful. 500 years from now, I'll bet you some historian will write a book pointing out the various things we did and believed that we didn't think were all that bad. We thought it was just totally normal that we do X, Y, or Z thing. I can't tell you what it is because I don't know what it is because I'm part of this time and place myself. I'm sure there will be things hundreds of years from now people will look back on us and say like, oh my gosh, this was shocking, how horrible. And we wouldn't want to be judged simply for that thing, right? I would hope that people in the future will be maybe a little more empathetic and they will see us, well, it's kind of like you, right? All of us, right? All of us as individuals are complex, multifaceted people. You wouldn't like it. None of us would like it if somebody boiled us down to just one thing, right? As if you were to say like, oh, that person is always, I don't know, like he always, doesn't get along with people and he's always kind of angry. It's all because he had a bad relationship with his father, which is sort of like a psychoanalyzing thing maybe you might say about someone. Well, that's kind of unfair, right? We are more than just like that one thing you want to know about someone. Although we always kind of do it, don't we, right? Again, this requires understanding the world as someone else sees it, even if we don't agree with it. Like I'm not saying be a relativist and say that, that there's no moral standards, right? But being able to understand historical actors as people, as real flesh and blood people with their own very complicated motives, that is a tough thing to do. And so remembering that people thought differently, sometimes for good reason thought differently than us, is a tricky and important thing. So that is it. I should really cut it there. Thank you for this. I think that'll do it.